When pirates broke the rules, the punishment was swift, and often terrifying. From being abandoned on a desert island to lashes that tore skin from bone, pirate justice was brutal. Picture this. It's 1720, and you're standing on the deck of a pirate ship somewhere in the Caribbean. The sun beats down mercilessly as your fellow pirates form a circle around you. You've been accused of stealing from the communal treasure chest. Just a handful of silver coins that you thought no one would miss. But in the world of piracy, where survival depends on absolute trust and unwavering loyalty, your moment of weakness has sealed your fate. The quartermaster reads the charges against you in a voice that carries across the water. Your shipmates, men who have shared rum with you, fought alongside you, and called you brother, now stare at you with cold eyes. They know what must be done. The pirate code is clear, and the punishment for theft is severe. In a few hours, you'll find yourself alone on a barren island with nothing but a bottle of water, a small piece of bread, and a single-shot pistol, the traditional tools of marooning, pirate justice's most feared punishment. Which was worse, the whip, or being left alone to die? 4 generations of pirates who lived by their own harsh codes. This wasn't a philosophical question. It was a terrifying reality that governed every aspect of life aboard these floating republics of outlaws. The pirate codes that emerged during the golden age of piracy were unjust guidelines for sharing treasure or organizing raids. They were comprehensive legal systems that included detailed provisions for punishment, each carefully designed to maintain the discipline and unity that meant the difference between life and death on the high seas. These weren't arbitrary cruelties imposed by sadistic captains, but carefully calculated consequences that every pirate agreed to face when he signed the ship's articles. To understand pirate punishments, you must first understand the unique pressures and dangers that shaped pirate society. A pirate ship wasn't just a vessel. It was a complete community compressed into a few hundred square feet of deck space, where dozens or sometimes hundreds of men lived in conditions that would challenge even the strongest bonds of friendship and loyalty. Imagine being trapped in a confined space with the same group of people for months at a time, facing constant dangers from storms, disease, enemy ships, and the ever-present threat of capture and execution. Now, imagine that your survival depends not just on your own actions, but on the reliability and courage of every single person sharing that cramped space with you. In such an environment, even small acts of selfishness, cowardice, or betrayal could have catastrophic consequences for everyone aboard. This is why pirates developed punishment systems that seem shockingly severe by modern standards. They weren't motivated by sadism or a love of violence. They were driven by the cold calculation that harsh consequences for misconduct were essential for the survival of the entire crew. A single coward who fled from battle could doom his shipmates to death or capture. A thief who stole from the common fund could destroy the trust that held the crew together. A drunk who failed to do his duty during a storm could cause the ship to founder with all hands lost. Pirates understood that on land, communities could afford to show mercy to wrongdoers, exile them, or imprison them until they reformed their ways. At sea, surrounded by enemies and dependent on each other for survival, there was no room for second chances when it came to serious breaches of discipline. But pirate punishments weren't just about deterrence. They were also about fairness and democratic accountability in ways that were revolutionary for their time. Unlike the arbitrary brutality that characterized many legitimate military and naval organizations, pirate punishments were administered according to clearly defined rules that every crew member had agreed to follow. No one could be punished without a trial by his peers, and every sentence had to be approved by a majority of the crew. This democratic approach to discipline created a unique dynamic aboard pirate ships. The same men who might vote to have you flogged or marooned were also your brothers in arms, people whose lives you might save in the next battle. This personal dimension of pirate justice made it both more humane and more terrible than the impersonal brutality of legitimate authority. The contrast with legitimate naval discipline was stark and telling. In the Royal Navy, for example, captains had virtually unlimited authority to impose punishments on their crews. A sailor could be flogged, keel-hauled, or hanged on the captain's word alone, with no trial, no appeal, and no consideration of the circumstances that might have led to his alleged misconduct. Naval punishments were designed primarily to demonstrate the absolute authority of officers over their subordinates, to remind common sailors of their place in the rigid hierarchy that governed military life. Fear was the primary tool of discipline, and that fear was often justified by the arbitrary and excessive nature of naval justice. Pirate punishments, by contrast, were designed to preserve the democratic and egalitarian principles that made pirate crews so effective. They were severe when severity was necessary, but they were also fair in ways that legitimate authority rarely managed to achieve. Every pirate knew exactly what behavior would lead to punishment and what form that punishment would take. No one was above the law. Even captains could be tried and punished if they violated the ship's articles. This predictability and fairness didn't make pirate punishments any less terrifying, but it did give them a moral authority that arbitrary brutality could never achieve. Pirates who faced punishment knew that they were being judged by the same standards they had agreed to uphold, by men who faced the same dangers and shared the same risks. The psychology of pirate punishment was as important as its physical reality. The threat of severe consequences served as a constant reminder of the standards expected aboard the ship, while the public nature of trials and punishments reinforced the collective values that held the crew together. When a pirate was tried before his shipmates, everyone present was reminded of their own obligations and the consequences of failing to meet them. When punishment was administered publicly, it served not just to penalize the wrongdoer, but to reaffirm the community's commitment to its shared values and mutual survival. The most feared punishment in the pirate arsenal was marooning, abandoning the condemned man on a deserted island or isolated coastline with minimal supplies and no hope of rescue. This wasn't just a death sentence. It was a particularly cruel form of execution that combined the terror of abandonment with the slow agony of starvation, thirst, and despair. The ritual of marooning was carefully prescribed and deeply symbolic. The condemned man would be given a bottle of fresh water, usually enough for no more than a few days. A small quantity of food might be provided, typically hard biscuit or dried meat that would last only slightly longer than the water. Most importantly, the marooned pirate would receive a pistol with a single shot, not for protection or hunting, but as a tool of mercy when the suffering became unbearable. Sometimes, if the crew felt particularly generous, or if the condemned man had previously shown great courage or service, additional items might be provided. A Bible for spiritual comfort, a knife for practical use, or even a small amount of rum to ease the final moments. But these were rare mercies, and they didn't change the ultimate reality that marooning was designed to be fatal. The psychological impact of marooning was as devastating as its physical consequences. The condemned man would watch helplessly as his ship sailed away, leaving him alone with the knowledge that he would almost certainly die on that desolate shore. The isolation was complete and terrible. No human companionship, no hope of rescue, nothing but the endless expanse of sea and sky and the gradual approach of death. Some marooned pirates lasted days, some weeks, and a very few managed to survive long enough to be rescued by passing ships or to find ways to escape their island prisons. But these were extraordinary exceptions. For most, marooning meant a slow and agonizing death, made worse by the knowledge that their fate was the direct result of their own choices and actions. The case of Captain Charles Vane illustrates both the severity and the democratic nature of pirate justice. Vane was a successful and respected pirate captain, who had led his crew to numerous victories and considerable wealth. However, in November 1718, Vane made a decision that his crew considered an unforgivable act of cowardice. When Vane's ship encountered a French man-of-war off the coast of South Carolina, the captain chose to avoid battle rather than risk an engagement with the heavily armed enemy vessel. From Vane's perspective, this was prudent seamanship. The French ship was larger and better armed than his own vessel, and an attack would have been suicidal. But Vane's crew saw things differently. They had joined him with the expectation that he would lead them to glory and riches through bold attacks on enemy shipping. His refusal to fight when the opportunity presented itself was seen not as wisdom but as cowardice, a violation of the fundamental obligation that every pirate owed to his shipmates. The crew called a formal meeting to discuss their captain's conduct. Vane was given the opportunity to defend his decision, to explain his reasoning and argue for his position. But his arguments failed to convince his shipmates, who voted overwhelmingly to remove him from command and elect a new captain in his place. But removal from office wasn't enough for Vane's accusers. They argued that his cowardice had cost them a valuable prize and had brought dishonor upon the entire crew. After further deliberation, they voted to impose the ultimate punishment. Vane would be marooned, along with a few supporters who chose to remain loyal to him. The sentence was carried out according to established procedures. Vane was provided with a small boat, basic supplies, and the opportunity to take any crew members who wished to accompany him. He was allowed to make a final speech to his former shipmates, though his words did nothing to change their determination to see justice done. Vane's marooning demonstrates several important aspects of pirate justice. First, it shows that even the most successful and respected pirates were immune from punishment if they violated the crew's expectations. Second, it illustrates the democratic nature of pirate discipline. Vane was uncondemned by a single individual but by a collective decision of his peers. Finally, it reveals the harsh pragmatism that governed pirate society. Personal loyalty and past service weren't enough to excuse behavior that threatened the crew's welfare and honor. Interestingly, Vane's story didn't end with his marooning. He and his loyal companions managed to survive on their island refuge and eventually found passage aboard a merchant vessel. Vane attempted to return to piracy, but his reputation had been permanently damaged by his removal and punishment. He was eventually captured by authorities and executed. But his initial survival of marooning made him one of the rare exceptions to the usual fatal outcome of this punishment. While marooning was the most feared punishment, flogging was probably the most common form of severe discipline aboard pirate ships. Unlike the instant finality of marooning or execution, flogging allowed for graduated responses to misconduct. 12 lashes for a first offense, 50 for a repeat violation, hundreds for serious crimes that fell short of capital punishment. The implements of flogging varied depending on what was available aboard ship and the traditions of the particular crew. The Cato ninetails was the most famous flogging instrument, a handle attached to 9 separate cords, each often tipped with knots or pieces of metal that would tear the flesh with each blow. But pirates also used simple rope, leather whips, or even improvised instruments made from whatever materials were at hand. The administration of flogging was a public ritual that involved the entire crew. The condemned man would be stripped to the waist and tied to the ship's rigging or to a specially constructed flogging frame. The charges against him would be read aloud, and the sentence would be announced so that everyone present understood exactly why the punishment was being administered. The actual flogging would be carried out by a designated crew member, often the ship's bosun or another officer appointed for the task. The person administering the punishment had to be strong enough to deliver effective blows, but also disciplined enough to carry out the sentence exactly as ordered. No more lashes than specified, but also no holding back out of misplaced mercy. Each blow of the lash would strip away skin and flesh, creating wounds that would bleed freely and heal slowly in the harsh maritime environment. After a severe flogging, the victim's back would be a mass of torn tissue, and infection was a constant danger that could kill as surely as the lashes themselves. The pain of flogging was immediate and overwhelming, but it was also designed to have lasting psychological effects. The scars left by a severe flogging would serve as permanent reminders of the consequences of misconduct, both for the victim and for everyone who saw them. In the tight quarters of a pirate ship, these visible marks of punishment were impossible to hide, and served as constant warnings to other crew members. But flogging wasn't just about inflicting pain. It was also about public humiliation and the reaffirmation of community standards. The public nature of the punishment was essential to its effectiveness. Every crew member was required to witness the flogging, to see the consequences of violating the ship's code, and to be reminded of their own obligations to their shipmates. The crimes that typically led to flogging were those that threatened ship discipline without rising to the level of capital offenses. Drunkenness on duty, fighting among crew members, insubordination to officers, laziness, or minor theft might all result in a sentence of lashes. The number of lashes would depend on the severity of the offense and the offender's previous record. A first-time offender guilty of a minor infraction might receive 12 lashes, enough to be painful and humiliating, but not enough to cause permanent injury or interfere with his ability to work. A repeat offender or someone guilty of a more serious breach might face 50 or 100 lashes, a punishment severe enough to leave lasting scars and serve as a permanent reminder of the consequences of misconduct. In extreme cases, pirates might be sentenced to several hundred lashes, a punishment that was often fatal. The human body can only endure so much trauma, and a severe flogging could cause death from blood loss, shock, or subsequent infection. When pirate codes specified such harsh sentences, they were essentially imposing delayed death sentences that allowed the condemned man to reflect on his crimes while experiencing prolonged agony. The recovery period after a severe flogging was almost as important as the punishment itself. The victim would be incapacitated for days or weeks, unable to perform his duties while his wounds slowly healed. During this time, he would be dependent on his shipmates for care and survival. A humbling experience that reinforced his place in the ship's hierarchy and his dependence on the community he had wronged. The medical treatment of flogging victims varied considerably depending on the resources available aboard ship and the attitudes of the crew toward the punished individual. Some crews provided basic medical care to help prevent infection and speed healing, while others left the victim to recover on his own as part of the punishment. Ship's surgeons, when they were available, might clean and dress the wounds, provide medications to prevent infection, and monitor the victim's recovery. But medical knowledge in the 18th century was limited. and many flogging victims died from complications that might have been easily treatable with modern medical care. The social dynamics surrounding flogging were complex and often contradictory. The same men who voted to impose the punishment might later provide comfort and care to the victim. Recognizing that while discipline was necessary, the punished individual remained a valuable member of the crew whose recovery served everyone's interests. This combination of harsh justice and practical compassion was characteristic of pirate society more generally. Pirates could be brutal when they felt brutality was necessary, but they were also capable of surprising kindness and loyalty when the immediate crisis had passed. Perhaps the most horrifying punishment in the pirate arsenal was keel hauling, dragging the condemned man under the ship's keel from one side to the other. This punishment was so severe that it was rarely actually implemented, serving more as a terrible threat than as a routine disciplinary measure. The process of keel hauling was as gruesome as it sounds. The victim would be tied to a rope that passed under the ship's hull, usually weighted with cannonballs or other heavy objects to ensure he sank deep enough to pass beneath the keel. He would then be thrown overboard on one side of the ship and dragged underwater to the other side. The journey under the ship's hull was a nightmare of multiple torments. The victim would be dragged across the ship's bottom, which was covered with sharp barnacles, razor-edged shells, and other marine growth that would strip the flesh from his body like 1,000 tiny knives. At the same time, he would be drowning, his lungs filling with seawater as he was pulled through the depths. If the victim survived the passage, and many did not, he would emerge on the other side of the ship as a bloody, broken wreck, his body lacerated by the barnacles and his lungs full of seawater. Death often came from drowning during the passage, from blood loss due to the lacerations, or from infection of the massive wounds inflicted by the ship's hull. The few who survived keel hauling were permanently marked by the experience. The scars left by the barnacles were distinctive and unmistakable, serving as visible proof of the terrible punishment they had endured. These men became living warnings to other pirates of the consequences of serious misconduct. Because of its severity and frequent fatality, keel hauling was reserved for only the most serious offenses, crimes that warranted death, but where the crew wanted to give the offender a chance, however slim, of survival. It was also sometimes used as a form of trial by ordeal, with survival being taken as evidence of divine favor or exceptional courage. The rarity of actual keel hauling meant that many pirates had heard of the punishment but never witnessed it firsthand. This added to its psychological impact as a deterrent. The unknown details of the experience left room for imagination to amplify the terror. Stories of keel hauling grew in the telling, becoming legendary examples of pirate brutality that served to maintain discipline through fear. Some pirate crews developed variations on traditional keel hauling that were designed to be less frequently fatal while maintaining the punishment's deterrent effect. A victim might be dragged under the ship multiple times at different depths, or he might be given breathing apparatus to increase his chances of survival. But even these merciful variations were extraordinarily dangerous and often resulted in permanent injury or death. The decision to impose keel hauling required unanimous or near-unanimous approval from the crew, reflecting the recognition that this was an extreme measure that should only be used in the most serious cases. The process of voting on such a severe punishment also served to distribute the moral responsibility among all crew members, ensuring that no single individual bore the burden of ordering such a terrible fate. When diplomatic solutions failed and personal disputes threatened to tear the crew apart, pirates often turned to dueling as a way of resolving conflicts. While maintaining honor and preserving ship discipline, Dueling was unjust a punishment. It was a carefully regulated method of conflict resolution that allowed aggrieved parties to settle their differences without dragging the entire crew into their dispute. Pirate duels followed established rules that were designed to ensure fairness while maximizing the dramatic impact of the combat. The most common form was pistol dueling, where the combatants would stand back to back, take a predetermined number of paces, turn on command, and fire simultaneously. The survivor would be considered vindicated, while the loser paid the ultimate price for his position in the dispute. Sword dueling was also practiced, though it was less common because it required specialized weapons and skills that not all pirates possessed. These combats were typically fought to first blood, or until one combatant was unable to continue, though death was always a possibility when edged weapons were involved. The formal nature of pirate dueling was crucial to its effectiveness as a conflict resolution mechanism. Duels couldn't be fought in the heat of anger or on sudden impulse. They had to be formally challenged, accepted, and scheduled according to established procedures. This gave both parties time to consider whether their grievance was truly worth risking their lives over. Many disputes that began with challenges to duel were actually resolved through negotiation. During the waiting period before the combat was scheduled to take place, the formal challenge served as a way for both parties to demonstrate their courage and commitment to their positions while creating opportunities for face-saving, compromises that would allow both men to back down without appearing cowardly. When duels were actually fought, they served multiple purposes beyond simply resolving the immediate dispute. They provided entertainment for the crew, demonstrated the courage and skill of the combatants, and reinforced the values of honor and personal responsibility that were central to pirate culture. The outcome of a duel was accepted as final by all parties. The survivor was considered to have been vindicated by his victory, while the loser's defeat was taken as evidence that his position in the dispute had been wrong. This divine judgment aspect of dueling helped to legitimize the outcomes and prevent future disputes over the same issues. Dueling also served as a form of population control in the tight confines of a pirate ship. When personality conflicts became severe enough to threaten crew unity, a duel could eliminate one of the conflicting parties while allowing the other to continue serving aboard the ship without loss of face or status. The rules governing when duels could be demanded and fought varied among different pirate crews, but most codes included provisions that prevented dueling from being used as a tool of oppression or intimidation. Frivolous challenges were discouraged or forbidden, and some crews required approval from the ship's officers or from the crew as a whole before a duel could take place. The weapons and conditions of dueling were typically standardized within each crew to ensure fairness and prevent disputes about the terms of combat. Pistols would be identical and loaded by neutral parties. Distances would be measured precisely, and the commands for turning and firing would be given by designated officials. Medical care for dueling participants was usually provided regardless of the outcome, reflecting the recognition that courage in accepting a challenge deserved respect. Even if the challenger ultimately lost the combat, the winner was expected to show magnanimity toward his fallen opponent. An excessive celebration or gloating over victory was considered poor form. Not all pirate punishments involved physical suffering or mortal danger. For many offenses, the loss of shares in captured prizes provided an effective deterrent that struck directly at the economic motives that drove most men to piracy in the first place. The share system that governed the distribution of pirate wealth was carefully regulated and precisely calculated. Each crew member knew exactly what portion of any captured treasure he was entitled to receive, and any reduction in that share represented a significant economic penalty that could affect his financial prospects for months or years. Minor infractions might result in the loss of a small portion of the offender's share in the next prize captured by the crew. More serious violations could result in the forfeiture of his entire share, or even his shares from multiple prizes. In extreme cases, a pirate might be sentenced to serve without compensation for a specified period, working for the benefit of his shipmates without receiving any of the rewards. The psychological impact of losing shares was often greater than the mere economic loss. Pirates prided themselves on their earning ability and their success in accumulating wealth through their dangerous profession. To have that success diminished by punishment was a blow to their professional pride, as well as their financial prospects. The loss of shares also served as a form of restitution to the crew as a whole. When a pirate's misconduct cost the ship money or opportunities for profit, the forfeiture of his share helped to compensate his shipmates for their losses. This created a direct connection between the offense and its consequences, making the punishment feel more just and appropriate. Some pirate codes established elaborate formulas for calculating the loss of shares based on the specific nature and severity of each offense. Drunkenness might cost a pirate 1 day's share. Fighting with a shipmate might cost a week's worth. And more serious offenses might result in proportionally greater losses. The administration of share loss punishments required careful record-keeping and honest accounting from the ship's officers. The quartermaster, who was typically responsible for dividing captured wealth, had to track each crew member's accumulated penalties and adjust distributions accordingly. This created additional incentives for fair and transparent governance. Since any perception of favoritism or corruption in the distribution process could lead to serious unrest among the crew, the effectiveness of share loss punishments depended partly on the crew's success in capturing prizes. During periods when few ships were taken and little wealth was accumulated, the threat of losing non-existent profits provided little deterrent to misconduct. During successful periods when treasure was flowing freely, the loss of substantial sums could be devastating to the offender's long-term prospects. Some pirates preferred the risk of physical punishment to the certainty of economic loss, calculating that they had a better chance of surviving a flogging than of earning back the wealth they would lose through forfeiture of shares. Others found the economic punishment more tolerable than physical suffering, even when the financial impact was severe. The flexibility of share loss punishments made them particularly useful for addressing misconduct that fell into gray areas, where physical punishment might be excessive, but some form of consequences was clearly necessary. A pirate who was chronically late for duty, who consistently failed to maintain his equipment properly, or who showed poor judgment in minor matters might face economic penalties that would encourage better behavior without inflicting lasting physical harm. When all other remedies failed, and when crimes were so serious that they threatened the very survival of the crew, pirates turned to their ultimate sanction: immediate execution. This was unto punishment to be imposed lightly or arbitrarily. It required careful deliberation and usually unanimous or near-unanimous approval from the crew. The crimes that warranted immediate execution were those that struck at the fundamental bonds of trust and loyalty that held pirate crews together. Murder of a shipmate was perhaps the most obvious capital offense, since it violated the basic principle that pirates must be able to trust each other with their lives. Treason, providing information to enemies, attempting to betray the ship to authorities, or sabotaging the crew's operations, was equally serious because it threatened everyone's safety and freedom. Theft from the common treasure was sometimes punishable by death, particularly when the amounts involved were substantial, or when the theft represented a betrayal of the democratic principles that governed the distribution of wealth. Cowardice in battle could also warrant execution, especially if it contributed to the loss of a prize or the death of other crew members. The methods of execution varied depending on the traditions of the crew and the resources available aboard ship. Hanging was perhaps the most common method, often carried out from the ship's yardarm, in full view of the assembled crew and any other vessels that might be in the area. The public nature of these executions served both to demonstrate the crew's commitment to justice and to warn other pirates of the consequences of serious misconduct. Shooting was also used, sometimes as a form of military execution, for crimes related to cowardice or desertion in battle. The condemned man might be blindfolded and shot by a firing squad of his former shipmates, or he might be given the opportunity to face his executioners with dignity and courage. In some cases, executions took more creative forms that reflected the specific nature of the crime or the preferences of the crew. Pirates who had betrayed their shipmates to enemies might be thrown overboard to drown, symbolically returning them to the sea from which they had emerged. Murderers might be dispatched using the same method they had used to kill their victims, creating a form of poetic justice that satisfied the crew's desire for appropriate retribution. The ritual aspects of pirate executions were as important as the practical ones. The condemned man was typically given time to prepare for death, to make peace with whatever gods he worshipped, and to address his shipmates with any final words he wished to speak. These speeches often became legendary, with particularly courageous or eloquent final statements being remembered and repeated for years afterward. The crew's participation in executions was both collective and individual, while the decision to impose a death sentence required group approval. The actual carrying out of the execution was usually assigned to specific individuals, who were chosen either by lot or by volunteer. This distribution of responsibility helped to prevent any single person from bearing the full psychological burden of taking a life. The aftermath of executions was carefully managed to maintain crew morale and unity. The dead man's possessions would be distributed among his shipmates according to established procedures, and his name might be struck from the ship's records, as if he had never existed. At the same time, his courage in facing death, if he had shown such courage, would be acknowledged and respected, maintaining the distinction between condemning the crime and honoring the person. Some pirate crews developed elaborate ceremonies around executions that were designed to emphasize the solemnity and necessity of the proceedings. These might include formal readings of the charges, ritual invocations of divine justice, or symbolic gestures that represented the crew's commitment to their shared values and mutual survival. The frequency of executions varied considerably among different pirate crews and different time periods. Some crews went years without executing anyone, while others found it necessary to impose capital punishment regularly to maintain discipline and loyalty. The variation reflected differences in leadership, crew composition, and the specific challenges faced by each pirate community. The decision-making process that led to execution sentences was typically more elaborate and careful than for lesser punishments. Multiple meetings might be held to discuss the case, witnesses would be called to testify, and the accused would be given extensive opportunities to defend himself or to present mitigating circumstances. This careful deliberation reflected the recognition that execution was irreversible and that mistakes in capital cases could not be corrected. Pirates understood that they were taking a human life, and most crews took this responsibility seriously even when they were convinced that execution was necessary for their survival and security. The impact of executions on crew morale was complex and often contradictory. On one hand, the death of a shipmate was always a loss that weakened the crew's fighting capacity and eliminated someone who might have been a friend or valued colleague. On the other hand, the demonstration that serious misconduct would be punished without regard for personal relationships or past service could strengthen crew discipline and mutual trust. The families and friends of executed pirates sometimes sought revenge against the crews that had killed their loved ones, creating ongoing cycles of violence and retaliation that could last for years. This external pressure added another dimension to the decision to execute crew members, since it might create future enemies and complications for the crew. When we examine pirate punishments in their historical context, what emerges is a picture that challenges many common assumptions about both pirate society and 18th-century justice more generally. Far from being arbitrary or sadistic, most pirate punishments were carefully calibrated responses to specific threats to crew survival and unity. They were severe when severity was necessary, but they were also fair in ways that legitimate legal systems of the time rarely managed to achieve. The democratic nature of pirate justice was perhaps its most remarkable feature. Unlike the arbitrary brutality that characterized military and naval discipline, pirate punishments were imposed only after collective deliberation and with the approval of the community as a whole. Every crew member knew exactly what behaviors would lead to punishment and what form that punishment would take. This predictability and transparency created a form of legitimacy that arbitrary authority could never achieve. Pirates who faced punishment knew that they were being judged by the same standards they had agreed to uphold, by men who shared the same dangers and faced the same risks. The collective nature of pirate justice also meant that responsibility for harsh punishments was shared among all crew members, rather than being concentrated in the hands of a single individual. The contrast with contemporary legal systems was stark and usually favorable to the pirates. In legitimate society, justice was typically administered by individuals with absolute authority, who were accountable to no one but their social superiors. A naval captain could have sailors flogged to death for minor infractions. A colonial governor could order executions for political reasons, and aristocrats could brutalize peasants with impunity. Pirates, by contrast, had created legal systems that were based on the consent of the governed and that provided significant protections for individual rights. While their punishments were often severe, they were administered according to established rules and democratic procedures that ensured fairness and prevented the arbitrary abuse of power. The egalitarian nature of pirate justice was equally remarkable. Unlike legitimate legal systems, which typically treated people differently based on their social class, wealth, or family connections, pirate codes applied equally to all crew members regardless of their background or previous status. A former slave and a former gentleman would receive identical treatment if they committed the same offense. This commitment to equality extended even to the ship's officers. Captains, quartermasters, and other leaders were subject to the same laws and punishments as ordinary crew members. There are documented cases of pirate captains being tried, convicted, and punished by their own crews for violations of the ship's articles. The effectiveness of pirate punishments in maintaining discipline and unity aboard ship is evidenced by the remarkable success that many pirate crews achieved in their military and economic enterprises. These were not random collections of criminals and outcasts, but highly organized and disciplined fighting forces that could outmaneuver and outfight much larger and better equipped opponents. The fierce loyalty that characterized successful pirate crews was partly the result of fair treatment and democratic governance. But it was also the product of a justice system that everyone understood and respected. Pirates fought with extraordinary courage and determination, partly because they believed in the communities they had created and the principles those communities represented. The educational impact of pirate punishments extended beyond their immediate deterrent effects to include positive lessons about citizenship, responsibility, and mutual obligation. Pirates learned through participation in trials and punishments that their individual actions had consequences for the entire crew and that they had both rights and responsibilities as members of their democratic community. These lessons proved valuable to many former pirates who eventually left their outlaw careers for legitimate occupations. The experience of living under fair and predictable legal systems, of participating in democratic decision-making, and of accepting collective responsibility for community welfare prepared them for citizenship in the democratic societies that were beginning to emerge. In the Americas, during the 18th century, the influence of pirate justice on broader legal and political development is difficult to measure precisely. But there is evidence that pirate practices contributed to the evolution of more democratic and egalitarian approaches to law and governance. Sailors who had served aboard pirate ships carried their experiences to other contexts, potentially influencing the development of maritime labor organizations, frontier communities, and even colonial political movements. The documentation of pirate punishments in contemporary sources provides modern scholars with unusually detailed insights into the practical operation of alternative legal systems. Unlike many historical communities, pirates often took care to record their laws and legal proceedings, creating archives that illuminate the day-to-day functioning of their democratic institutions. These records reveal that pirate justice, while harsh, was administered according to sophisticated principles that recognized the complexity of human motivation and the practical requirements of community survival. Pirates understood that effective punishment required not just deterrence but also education. Not just retribution but also restoration of community harmony. The psychological sophistication of pirate justice systems is evident in their careful attention to ritual, ceremony, and public participation. Pirates understood intuitively that justice required more than simply inflicting consequences on wrongdoers. It also required community involvement, moral education, and the reaffirmation of shared values. The public nature of pirate trials and punishments served multiple functions beyond simple deterrence. It ensured that everyone understood the standards expected of community members. It provided opportunities for moral instruction and collective decision-making, and it created shared experiences that strengthened the bonds holding the crew together. The flexibility of pirate justice systems allowed them to adapt to changing circumstances and to learn from experience in ways that more rigid legal structures could not. Pirates were constantly experimenting with new approaches to discipline and punishment, adopting practices that proved effective and abandoning those that did not serve their purposes. This experimental approach to justice was possible partly because pirate communities were small, enough to allow direct democracy and collective learning, but it was also the result of their pragmatic focus on survival and effectiveness rather than tradition or abstract principle. Pirates were interested in what worked, not in what had always been done or what looked respectable to outside observers. The international character of many pirate crews created opportunities for legal innovation that were rare in the 18th century. pirates from different national backgrounds brought various traditions of punishment and justice to their crews, and the democratic nature of pirate decision-making allowed the best features of these different systems to be combined and adapted to maritime conditions. English pirates contributed concepts of due process and proportionate punishment. Spanish pirates brought traditions of written legal codes. French pirates added ideas about individual rights and collective responsibility, and African pirates shared approaches to restorative justice and community healing. The synthesis of these different legal traditions produced punishment systems that were often more sophisticated and humane than any of their individual components. The economic dimensions of pirate punishments reflected the unique financial structures of pirate society, where wealth was shared collectively and where individual prosperity depended on group success. This created incentives for punishment systems that would preserve the crew's fighting effectiveness while still imposing meaningful consequences for misconduct. The share loss penalties that were common in pirate codes represented an early form of financial punishment that parallels modern approaches to white-collar crime and regulatory violations. Rather than simply inflicting physical suffering, these punishments struck directly at the economic motives that had led men to piracy, while allowing them to continue contributing to the crew's military effectiveness. The medical aspects of pirate punishments were complicated by the limited healthcare resources available aboard ship, and the practical requirements of maintaining crew strength. Punishments had to be severe enough to deter misconduct, but not so debilitating that they eliminated valuable crew members from active service. Ship's surgeons, when they were available, played important roles in both the administration and aftermath of physical punishments. They might be called upon to assess a condemned man's fitness to undergo punishment, to monitor the administration of flogging to prevent excessive injury, and to provide care during recovery periods. The medical knowledge of the 18th century was primitive by modern standards, but pirate surgeons often developed considerable expertise in treating the specific types of injuries caused by maritime punishments. They learned to clean and dress flogging wounds, to set bones broken during keel hauling, and to manage the infections that commonly followed physical punishment. The relationship between punishment and medical care created interesting ethical dilemmas for ship's surgeons. They were expected to help maintain crew discipline by participating in the punishment process, but they were also responsible for preserving the health and fighting capability of the men they treated. Balancing these competing obligations required considerable skill and judgment. Some pirate crews developed sophisticated approaches to punishment that took medical considerations into account. A man who was already injured or ill might have his punishment postponed until he recovered, or he might receive a modified sentence that would not interfere with his medical treatment. These adaptations demonstrated the practical wisdom that characterized the best pirate justice systems. The seasonal nature of pirate operations created additional complications for the administration of punishment. Crews that disbanded during winter months might have to defer trials and sentences until they reassembled for the next sailing season, requiring careful documentation and witness preservation over extended periods. Some offences that occurred late in the sailing season might be dealt with hastily before the crew separated, while others might be carried over to the following year. These timing issues required sophisticated planning and record-keeping that demonstrated the organizational capabilities of successful pirate crews. The geographic mobility of pirate crews also influenced their approaches to punishment. Unlike land-based communities that could rely on permanent institutions like jails or stocks, pirates had to develop portable justice systems that could function effectively regardless of location. This mobility requirement favored punishments that could be administered quickly and completely, such as flogging or execution, over those that required extended periods of incarceration or supervision. It also encouraged the development of symbolic punishments that would have lasting psychological effects even after the immediate physical consequences had healed. The relationship between pirate punishments and their audiences extended beyond the immediate crew to include other pirates, potential recruits, captured enemies, and occasionally representatives of legitimate authority. The public nature of many punishments served to communicate messages about pirate values and capabilities to these various audiences. When pirates executed captured naval officers or colonial officials, they were sending messages about their rejection of legitimate authority and their willingness to use extreme measures to defend their independence. When they showed mercy to cooperative prisoners, they demonstrated that their violence was calculated and purposeful rather than merely sadistic. The reputation for fair but firm justice that some pirate crews developed helped them recruit quality crew members and maintain the loyalty of existing ones. Pirates talked among themselves when they met in ports and taverns, sharing stories about the treatment they had received aboard different ships. Crews known for arbitrary or excessive punishment found it difficult to attract experienced sailors, while those with reputations for fair dealing had their pick of potential recruits. This market-based pressure for fair treatment created incentives for pirate crews to develop and maintain justice systems that would be viewed favorably by the broader pirate community. It was not enough for a punishment system to maintain internal discipline. It also had to meet the expectations of the external community from which new crew members would be drawn. The documentation of pirate punishments in contemporary sources reveals considerable variation in both the severity and the methods of punishment used by different crews. Some pirates were known for their brutality and creative cruelty, while others developed reputations for fair dealing and proportionate justice. These variations reflected differences in leadership, crew composition, operational challenges, and cultural backgrounds. Crews led by psychopathic captains like Edward Lowe developed punishment systems that were characterized by arbitrary cruelty and excessive violence. Crews led by more balanced leaders, like Bartholomew Roberts, created sophisticated legal codes that provided extensive protections for individual rights. The success or failure of different approaches to punishment could be measured in practical terms by examining the loyalty, discipline, and fighting effectiveness of various pirate crews. Those with fair and predictable justice systems generally maintained better morale and achieved greater success in their military and economic enterprises. The psychological impact of witnessing punishments was as important as experiencing them directly. Every crew member who watched a flogging, execution, or marooning was reminded of the standards expected aboard the ship and the consequences of failing to meet those standards. These shared experiences of witnessing justice created collective memories that reinforced community values and mutual accountability. The ritual aspects of punishment ceremonies served to transform individual acts of discipline into community-wide educational experiences. The formal reading of charges, the opportunity for the accused to speak in his defense, the collective voting on guilt and punishment, and the public administration of sentences all contributed to a sense of shared participation in the justice process. These ceremonial elements also helped to legitimize harsh punishments by demonstrating that they were the result of careful deliberation and collective decision-making, rather than arbitrary cruelty or personal vendetta. The community's participation in the justice process created a sense of ownership and responsibility that made the outcomes more acceptable even when they were severe. The timing and staging of punishment ceremonies were carefully calculated to maximize their psychological impact. Executions might be scheduled for sunrise or sunset to take advantage of dramatic lighting. Floggings might be conducted during calm weather when the entire crew could assemble comfortably on deck, and marooning might be carried out within sight of other vessels to ensure maximum visibility. The location chosen for punishments also carried symbolic meaning. Executions at the ship's mainmast emphasized the connection between the punishment and the maritime way of life, while marooning on particularly desolate islands reinforced the finality and hopelessness of the sentence. The role of religion in pirate punishments was complex and often contradictory. While many pirates were nominally Christian and some crews included chaplains or religious services, the practical requirements of their outlaw lifestyle often conflicted with traditional religious teachings about mercy, forgiveness, and redemption. Some pirate codes included religious language and invoked divine authority for their punishments, while others were entirely secular in their approach to justice. The condemned were sometimes offered spiritual counsel before execution, and Bibles were occasionally included among the supplies provided to marooned pirates. However, the harsh realities of pirate life meant that religious considerations were typically subordinated to practical concerns about crew survival and discipline. Pirates might pray for forgiveness after carrying out brutal punishments, but they rarely allowed religious scruples to prevent them from doing what they believed was necessary for their collective survival. The gender dimensions of pirate punishments were largely unexplored due to the overwhelmingly male composition of most crews. The few women who served aboard pirate ships, such as Anne, Bonnie, and Mary Read, were generally subject to the same punishment codes as their male counterparts, though some crews had special provisions governing relationships and gender-related issues. The treatment of female prisoners captured during raids was governed by separate codes that reflected both practical considerations and cultural attitudes toward women. Some pirate crews forbade the abuse of female prisoners, while others showed no such restraint. These variations reflected differences in leadership and crew composition rather than systematic approaches to gender and justice. The age-related aspects of pirate punishments took into account the presence of boys and young men who might be members of the crew. Some codes included provisions for modified punishments for younger crew members, recognizing that boys might not be held to the same standards of judgment and self-control as adult pirates. However, the dangerous nature of pirate life meant that even young crew members were expected to meet basic standards of courage and loyalty. A boy who showed cowardice in battle or who betrayed his shipmates might face the same severe punishments as an adult, though he might also receive more opportunities for redemption and second chances. The educational function of punishments extended to these younger crew members, who were expected to learn from witnessing the consequences of misconduct by their elders. The public nature of trials and punishments provided opportunities for moral instruction and character development that were considered essential for preparing boys for adult responsibilities aboard ship. The relationship between pirate punishments and legitimate legal systems was complex and evolving throughout the golden age of piracy. While pirates operated outside the jurisdiction of colonial and metropolitan authorities, they could not entirely ignore the legal traditions and cultural expectations of the societies from which they had emerged. Some pirate practices represented direct rejections of legitimate legal principles, while others adapted established legal concepts to the unique requirements of maritime outlaws. The result was a hybrid system that combined elements of traditional maritime law, military justice, and democratic innovation. The influence worked in both directions, with pirate practices sometimes affecting the development of legitimate legal systems in colonial and frontier areas. Former pirates who returned to legitimate society brought with them experiences of democratic decision-making and collective responsibility that may have contributed to the evolution of more egalitarian legal traditions. The comparative study of pirate punishments reveals significant variations in both severity and methodology among different crews and different time periods. Some pirates were known for their extreme cruelty and innovative tortures, while others developed reputations for fair dealing and proportionate justice. These variations can be attributed to differences in leadership, crew composition, operational pressures, and cultural backgrounds. Crews operating in areas with strong legitimate authority faced different challenges than those in more remote regions. Crews composed primarily of former naval sailors brought different expectations and traditions than those made up mainly of escaped slaves or colonial rebels. The success or failure of different approaches to punishment can be measured by examining the loyalty, discipline, and operational effectiveness of various pirate crews. Those with fair and predictable justice systems generally maintained better morale and achieved greater success in their enterprises. The evolution of pirate punishments over time reflected both learning from experience and adaptation to changing circumstances. Early pirate crews often adopted punishment practices from legitimate maritime service, while later crews developed more sophisticated and specialized approaches that better served their unique needs. The decline of piracy in the 1720s and 1730s can be attributed partly to the success of government anti-piracy efforts, but it also reflected internal contradictions within pirate society that their punishment systems could not resolve. As pirate crews became larger and more successful, they also became more difficult to manage and more prone to internal conflicts that their justice systems struggled to address. The legacy of pirate punishments extends beyond their historical significance to influence modern thinking about crime, punishment, and community justice. The emphasis on collective decision-making, transparent procedures, and proportionate responses that characterized the best pirate justice systems continues to inform discussions about alternatives to traditional punitive approaches. Restorative justice programs, community courts, and various forms of alternative dispute resolution all reflect principles that were pioneered, in their own rough way, by pirate crews centuries ago. The idea that punishment should serve the interests of the community as a whole, rather than simply satisfying the desires of authorities for retribution, can be traced back to the democratic traditions of pirate society. The recognition that effective justice requires the consent and participation of the governed, that punishment should be proportionate to the offense, and that legal systems should be transparent and predictable. All of these principles were practiced by pirates long before they became established features of modern democratic legal systems. As we examine the full range of pirate punishments, from the relatively mild penalty of losing shares to the ultimate horror of keel hauling, we see a complex system of justice that was shaped by the unique pressures and opportunities of life at sea. These weren't random acts of cruelty or arbitrary exercises of power, but carefully calculated responses to specific threats to crew survival and unity. The severity of pirate punishments reflected the harsh realities of their environment, where a single act of cowardice, betrayal, or selfishness could doom the entire crew to death or capture. The fairness of their procedures reflected their commitment to democratic principles and their understanding that lasting discipline could only be achieved through the consent of the governed. The public nature of pirate justice served multiple functions. It provided education in community values, it demonstrated the consequences of misconduct, it involved everyone in the process of maintaining order, and it created shared experiences that strengthened the bonds holding the crew together. The variations in punishment practices among different crews reflected the experimental and adaptive nature of pirate society. Pirates were constantly learning from experience, adopting practices that proved effective, and abandoning those that did not serve their purposes. This flexibility and pragmatism helped them create justice systems that were often more effective and humane than their more rigid, legitimate counterparts. The democratic foundations of pirate punishment were perhaps their most remarkable feature. In an age when most legal systems were characterized by arbitrary authority and class-based discrimination, pirates created institutions based on equality, transparency, and collective responsibility. Every crew member had a voice in creating the laws that governed him, and every punishment required the approval of the community as a whole. This democratic approach to justice didn't make pirate punishments any less severe, but it did give them a legitimacy that arbitrary brutality could never achieve. Pirates who faced punishment knew that they were being judged according to standards they had helped create, by men who shared their dangers and their aspirations. The contrast with contemporary legitimate justice was stark and usually unfavorable to the established authorities. Naval captains could flog sailors to death for minor infractions. Colonial governors could order executions for political reasons, and aristocrats could abuse commoners with impunity. Pirates, despite their outlaw status, had created legal systems that were more fair, more predictable, and more responsive to the needs of their communities. The economic dimensions of pirate punishment, particularly the use of share forfeiture as an alternative to physical penalties, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of human motivation that was ahead of its time. Rather than relying solely on fear and pain as deterrents, pirates recognized that striking at economic interests could be equally effective while preserving the crew's fighting capability. The medical aspects of punishment administration showed a practical wisdom that balanced the need for severe consequences with the requirement to maintain crew strength. Punishments were calculated to achieve maximum deterrent effect while minimizing permanent damage to valuable crew members. The ritual and ceremonial elements of pirate justice served crucial psychological and social functions that went far beyond simple punishment. These public ceremonies educated the community, reinforced shared values, provided opportunities for collective decision-making, and created shared memories that strengthened crew unity. The international and multicultural character of many pirate crews created opportunities for legal innovation that were rare in the 18th century. The synthesis of different punishment traditions produced systems that were often more sophisticated and effective than any of their individual components. The influence of pirate punishment practices on broader legal and social development is difficult to measure precisely, but there is evidence that their innovations contributed to the evolution of more democratic and humane approaches to justice. Former pirates carried their experiences to other contexts, potentially influencing the development of maritime labor organizations, frontier communities, and colonial political movements. The documentation of pirate punishments provides modern scholars with valuable insights into the practical operation of alternative legal systems and the challenges of maintaining order in small, high-stress communities. The successes and failures of pirate justice offer lessons that remain relevant for contemporary efforts to create fair and effective legal institutions. For pirates, punishment was not cruelty for its own sake. It was survival. In the confined space of a ship, surrounded by enemies and dependent on each other for their very lives. Pirates understood that discipline wasn't just desirable, it was essential. Break the code, and you faced the sea's harshest justice. But that justice, harsh as it was, operated according to principles of fairness, transparency, and collective responsibility that were revolutionary for their time. The whip might tear flesh from bone. The desert island might offer nothing but a slow death under the burning sun, and the hangman's noose might end a life in minutes. But these punishments, terrible as they were administered according to laws that every pirate had helped create, by communities that every pirate had chosen to join, and for purposes that every pirate understood, not the arbitrary exercise of power, but the collective struggle for survival and freedom in a hostile world. In the end, pirate punishments were both a reflection of their harsh environment and a testament to their democratic ideals. They showed that even the most desperate and violent communities could create systems of justice based on fairness, equality, and mutual respect. The legacy of that achievement continues to inspire and instruct us, reminding us that the quest for justice is a fundamental human drive that transcends the boundaries of law and respectability. As the great pirate ships disappeared from the Caribbean seas, taking with them their crews and their codes, they left behind more than just stories of adventure and treasure. They left a record of human communities that had discovered in the crucible of outlaw life that true authority comes not from the barrel of a gun or the blessing of kings, but from the consent of free people choosing to govern themselves according to principles of justice, equality, and mutual responsibility. The punishments they imposed were swift, sure, and often terrifying. But they were also fair in ways that the legitimate world of their time could rarely match. Administered by communities that had proven that democracy could work even under the most challenging circumstances. In their rough justice, we can see the seeds of ideas that would eventually transform the world. That all people deserve equal treatment under law. That punishment should fit the crime, and that lasting order can only be achieved through the willing cooperation of free people united in common cause.